was right in there with.
Okay. Brooks, is everyone in?
Yep.
Okay. All right, I'd like to thank you all for joining us for Capturing Value with Cereal Rye. I'm Teddy Tomeo from NOFA, New York. I'm the Long Island Transitions Educator. We also have Brooks from NOFA Certification on for technical support. If you have any technical questions, feel free to contact Brooks directly via the chat. Just a reminder, remain muted with your video off during presentations. We have enabled closed captioning. These captions are auto-generated and not perfect. But if you would like to use the captions, there should be a notification on the top of your screen to enable them. This workshop is being recorded and will be shared on the conference website and mobile app shortly after the end of the presentation. All questions will be ahead to the end. If you think of anything, please feel free to type it in the chat box, or at the end we'll open up and you can ask questions directly. NOFA New York's annual winter conference would not be possible without the support of our generous sponsors. NOFA New York would like to specifically thank our app sponsors, Hudson Valley Farm Hub and Honey Dog Farm. To learn more about these organizations and their work, please visit them in the marketplace or online. Now I'd like to pass it off to Heather Darby of University of Vermont Extension and June Russell of Glenwood.
Great, thank you. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
I think I'm gonna go first. So I'm gonna head into it. June, let me see if I can. I can't share my screen.
Brooks, if you want to make Heather a co-host.
Just 1 second.
Yeah, no problem. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. We're going to be talking about rye, which is a really exciting topic.
Sorry about that, Heather. You should be okay.
Yeah,
now.
that's not a problem. No big deal. I'm going to put my thingy up here. Here we go. Now they can see your application. There we go. All right. Can you see it? Okay. I think June just.
Yeah, we can see it.
Okay, perfect. So as I mentioned, we're going to talk about winter rye today. Lots of different facets of rye, cereal rye. You might know it better by that grain that we cover crop with mostly. And June and I have sort of started to venture into looking at other uses for cereal rye, and that's really what we're going to be talking about today. And hopefully this picture gives you some sense of how rye can be utilized outside of cover cropping. So I don't want to talk too much about the history of rye, but it's a grain that is closely related to wheat and also barley. I would say it's more closely related to wheat. And it's, believed to have originated in the wild or from a wild rye in Asia. And it's been a staple grain for many people in Europe. But, for many people, it's considered inferior to wheat bread, but it definitely is a staple in many parts of Europe. And, the history records show that rye was transported to the Americas by English and Dutch settlers, and it's been here ever since. So again, a lot of history with rye, and I think mostly talking about how it wasn't really that great to eat and sort of inferior and not the best food, but if you mix it up with some other things, you can, get it down. But clearly that just really is a bit far from the truth, considering how popular and how widely the widespread growth of rye, especially throughout northern parts of Europe. Part of the reason for, I think, those particular parts of Europe growing rye is because rye is a highly adaptable grain. It's really hardy. And I think for many folks around the world, especially in northern parts, it's been a grain that has been able to survive under really even poor conditions. which makes us all figure out how to use what we can grow where we live. So I think that is definitely part of why rye is still an important grain in many parts of the world today. So most of the rye today is, as I mentioned, grown in Poland, Russia, Germany, and other parts of northern Europe. Most of the rye that's grown today is used for feed grain. So it's actually fed to beef, cattle, and hogs. About 50% of the rye grain grown in that part of the world goes to feed. And then the next largest portion going to baking, and then quite a bit of rye actually going into biogas production. Interestingly, I didn't see distilling in that list, June, of the primary uses for rye globally. And of course, rye whiskey is at least pretty important here in the United States. And maybe June can tell us a bit more about that later. So cereal rye has some very interesting characteristics that set it apart from some of the other grain. So rye itself has a lot of similarities to wheat, barley, and triticale. And of course, we think it originated from wheat in particular, but it's pretty different in its fiber content. It's much higher in fiber than wheat. And this little photo here, that's not a heart. It's actually a wheat grain, or a rye grain is A, and B is a wheat grain cut in half, and it's under a, dyed with these stains, and it's under a microscope. And the blue part, which again, when I first saw this in a paper I was reading, I thought it was a heart, like with all the capillary structure in it. But this is actually, the blue stain shows the fiber in the grain. So again, rye is A and B is wheat. So you can see actually how much more fiber is not just in the endosperm where we think about fiber, right? On the outside, there's a lot of it in the inside of the grain, which makes it really unique. And this fiber, a lot of it is pentosan, which is a nutritious fiber. There's a lot of nutritional benefits to it, which I'm not a nutritionist and I'm not a doctor. So I can't really dig into that, but this is one of the reasons that rye is considered more nutritious than some of the other grains. Now, rye also has a significant amount and types of different bioactive compounds that also contribute to the nutritional benefits of this grain. Now, wheat and rye both have these alkylresorinols. Somebody, I'm sure, can pronounce this way better than I did. Wheat has these as well. It's not necessarily special to rye, but these are important compounds that help control cholesterol and in weight management, body weight management, and some other things that I think June will probably mention. But really specific to rye are these benzosinoids. And these are really unique to rye, and they've also been closely linked to prostate health and assisting in treating prostate cancer. So rye is a pretty special grain, and this is, a limited list. And again, I'm an agronomist, not a nutritionist, so can't really dig into this, but it is really significant in the literature and the scientific knowledge around rye. So it's a hearty grain, but it also is really good for you. So again, rye is great for the Northeast. It's really hearty. It's probably the most hardy, I would say, of all the cereal grains that we grow here in the Northeast. We grow wheat, barley, oats, spelt, triticales, but again, rye is really well suited to our harsh climate. And as I mentioned before, that's part of the reason rye's been so prevalent in other parts of the world. So it's more tolerant of frost and also of drought than wheat. It's got a huge root system. It's much, much bigger than wheat. And it uses much less water than wheat does, but also having that bigger root system allows the rye to explore the soil more and able to acquire nutrients in different places, but also water. And we think that the root system, or we know, goes down at least a meter in depth. So rye does have, it uses less nutrients than some of the other grains. And again, it's just more tolerant, especially to acidity. Rye can survive and grow at pHs as low as 5, which is quite amazing because most grasses in general do not perform well below 5.8. So, and here we list 5.5 for canola, wheat, and corn. We do know that to maximize productivity, et cetera, we want to be above pHs of 6, but again, rye can grow in these really adverse conditions. So for those of you that don't know much about rye, just a few other tidbits of information. So rye is planted in the fall here in the Northeast and actually wherever it's grown. There have been some developments for spring seeded rye, but I don't believe those have gone too far. But rye is planted in the fall. Usually we try to plant it around the same time as other grains, like the 3rd week of September, last week of September, but it does tolerate much cooler temperatures for germination, which means that it can be planted much later than our other cereal grains. So it can actually germinate under very, very cool temperatures, which makes it, again, stand apart. So it grows pretty quickly, even under cool conditions, and it develops tillers. That's our goal. Doesn't always, but our goal is for it to develop tillers in the fall. And there's some pictures of this there in my little schematic. And in the second picture, you can see those tillers starting to form. And these are really important because the more tillers we have, ultimately, the more yield that we have. And you can see here that half of its yields will come from tillers. So getting that tillering in the fall is really critical to the yield the next year. Rye does require freezing temperatures, 40 to 60 days of those to be able to go through a vernalization period so that it will produce a seed head the next spring. It's wind pollinated. I'll talk about that more in a minute. And it's a 295-day crop, which sounds pretty long, but again, it's planted in the fall and then it matures for most of us in July of the following year. So what's another really interesting thing about rye that makes it really different from the other grains that we grow is it is strictly cross-pollinated. So all of our other grains are self-pollinating, but rye is an outcrosser, which is really fascinating. Wheat is not, none of the other grains, except for corn, of course. It's wind pollinated. Because of that, it also means that you can sort of see this inbred depression if you're saving your own seed, right? Because basically it's just crossing with itself over and over and over again. So most of the varieties that are out there are open pollinated, but oftentimes farmers will report yield depressions. And some of that has to do with the fact that it's just sort of continuing to breed upon itself. So if you see that, that's probably one of the reasons. And, you might want to mix up the varieties to get some hybrid vigor, really. So hybrids are out on the marketplace, rye hybrids. These are not open pollinated. And these have, I think they figured out how to sort of create these hybrids in the mid 80s, but they've really come onto the marketplace pretty strong in the last 5 years. And they're developed through a common breeding process, which again, I'm not a breeder either, but it's a sort of a male sterile system. And what this has really done for rye is that it's helped to push the yields to be more consistent and much higher. Similar to wheat, although wheat's not a hybrid, it's allowed the rye to sort of grow more uniformly, to be a little bit shorter, so it's not as prone to lodging. But probably one of the biggest things, besides the increased yield, because you're kind of getting that hybrid vigor, probably one of the biggest things that it's helped with is ergot control. And hybrids, rye hybrids tend to have a lot less ergot, which is a huge problem for cereal rye, than open pollinated types. All right, I guess I already talked about that. I got 2 of those in there. So let's talk about a couple of uses, and then I'll turn this over to June. So primarily, rye in the Northeast is best known for its use as a cover crop. And here's a couple of pictures of a cover crop growing here in the region. And most farms look at rye as a cover crop and a cover crop seed only. It's predominant here in the Northeast and actually much of the East because it's so widely adaptable and because you can plant it so late and you can still get a crop or still get it established to protect the soil. And again, it's just really hardy. It's very well suited to the Northeast. So it's become the predominant cover crop throughout the region. And excuse me, there hasn't been a lot of emphasis really on variety, right? Most people, they get a cover crop seed from the local seed dealer. It's usually VNS, which means variety not stated. They get whatever they can get. They get it on the ground. They're not out asking for a particular variety of rye. So we've kind of just looked at rye as rye, and now we're looking at rye as more than rye. Not trying to find other uses. There's lots of other uses, but trying to capitalize and capture some of the value add that rye has to offer beyond being a cover crop. And I actually don't want to underplay the fact that cover crops in our landscape here are really important, but there are other things that we can do with rye as well. And I think what is so exciting is that so many farmers are familiar with rye now because so many farmers are cover cropping. And at least in Vermont, it's the most widely grown grain in our entire state. There's 30,000 acres of rye planted every fall as a cover crop. So just thinking about what else could we do with that to maybe add additional value is what June and I are really investigating. So for many of our farms that I work with, dairy farms and livestock farms, they've found some real value in harvesting that cover crop as forage the next year, whether they're mowing it down and putting it into their bunks, or they're sending the cows out to graze it. And so this actually is not my work. This is from the Practical Farmers of Iowa. I've done a lot of work on harvesting rye as a forage, but I haven't compared it to other varieties necessarily. I've sort of done what I thought I should do is go out and just look at rye. But there are variety differences, especially in regards to yield. And these brown bars to the left show the yields of hybrid rye forage, which is really exciting. 2.5 tons of feed first thing in the spring is really helpful to many farmers or grazing. This feed is ready before anything else. And so if you're lacking feed, this is a really great option. And this is, what do you want to call that? This is rocket fuel feed. This is really good forage. Cereal rye for grain or for animal feed is also becoming increasingly popular. And you saw most of the rye goes to feed animals in Europe, but there's quite a discussion here in the United States as well to transition some of the grain that's fed to beef and hogs in particular to be rye. And here's the grain yields from our variety trials here in Vermont from 2022. And the red bars are the hybrids. So you can see they are yielding quite a bit higher. And this is grain yield than some of the open pollinated varieties. Some of our most, I guess, popular cover crop seed has been a rustic and spooner. And you can see it doesn't yield a lot of grain, but in that case, it may not actually be that important because those particular varieties may have better traits for cover cropping. And again, that's something we're looking at. But you can see with some of these hybrids, you can get about 5 tons of seed per acre. Rye is a feed grain. Again, this is something I was telling June this when we got on the phone that has actually was looked at in the 30s. So here's an extension report from 1932 about rye as a fattening feed for cattle and swine in South Dakota. So this is not new. People were looking at this quite a few years ago. And again, because rye is so adaptable, it doesn't use as much water. It doesn't use as much fertilizer. It can grow in really harsh climates. So all of these things are really important today as fertilizer prices are going up, as our concern around the climate becomes an increasing concern, and looking at ways to reduce inputs onto our agricultural fields. So this is becoming more a part of the conversation again throughout the country. And there's been research being conducted now, same research as the 30s in places like South Dakota, North Dakota, Illinois. And again, looking at feeding today's commercial hog and beef operations a portion of their diet of rye. And it's a good grain. It is different than corn, clearly. And different than barley, both of which are very popular feedstuffs in that industry. But they've also found that if you mix rye in with corn or barley and wheat, you don't see any less production out of the animals. So again, it's kind of exciting to see this moving forward. And if there are any livestock producers, we can talk about that more. I'm just going to end on some research that we've been doing with with rye for distilling, which has become very popular. And I know June will mention this. And we've been looking at varieties that work best for producing spirits, distilled spirits. And what's really interesting here, predicted spirit yield, this was done by Hartwick College. You can see Wheeler and Aristic, which are two traditional cover crop type varieties, did not yield much distilled spirits. But Hazelet, Ryman, Delero, Serafino, they did. What's in the middle, Sangosti, Progress, Gas, Grosseto, those are all hybrids. And you can see they didn't yield as much as some of our other varieties. Grain protein content, again, is very different in our rye varieties, which for baking actually doesn't really matter, not like wheat. But in brewing, we know that, or in distilling, we know that predicted spirit yield is correlated with protein concentrations. So varieties that have high protein generally tend to have lower distilled spirit yield. So again, we're still doing this research, but variety does matter. And depending on what you're going to use the rye for, if it's distilled spirits, for feed, for cover crop, for forage, or baking, you're probably going to want a different variety. And I think for us, that's really part of our goal, is to figure out, well, what's going to work best for each application. And I told June I'm already over my time, but I think we started a few minutes late, so I'll take 2 more minutes. We still have issues with fusarium head blight and mycotoxin production with rye. So very similar to wheat, we can see fusarium infection with rye, which is a problem. But it, like anything, we're trying to figure out if there's a difference in varieties, which we think there is. And we've been trying to evaluate that as well to see what varieties will have the best chance or the lowest risk of fusarium here in the Northeast. One last thing, we have been looking at baking metrics. A lot of rye bread is made, not so much here in the United States, but that's changing. And there's really an interest again, and a growing interest in using rye. And so what we've been really trying to figure out is, do the same metrics that we use to evaluate wheat for baking, is it the same for rye? And based on the literature research that I've done, and also the research that we have done, the answer is no. They are absolutely not the same. And I just recently found a paper, June, you'll be interested in that actually listed a number, a falling number suitable for rye for baking. And we've been investigating this for 3 years now. And we know that baking rye bread, we do not need a high falling number like we do with wheat. So with wheat, we recommend that the falling number be at least 250. Now in rye, we know that we don't need 250 falling number. And we've had successful baking with rye at 100. So what I recently found in the literature was a recommendation for 120 seconds as the falling number recommendation for rye, which aligns fairly well with what we've seen too. That same article said protein doesn't matter for baking with rye. So our data has also shown that too. So again, June and I are gonna continue to investigate rye varieties and the various properties in rye production to hopefully continue to add value to this really interesting and suitable for the Northeast grain. So June, I will stop and turn it over to you.
I realize I'm on mute. That's such important information around that falling number and protein content. I think you had an anecdote about bakers who are rejecting rye because they were looking for a comparable falling number to wheat. And so it's really important as we're trying to build this market that we understand, those quality parameters, and we're not throwing away good rye. Okay. Okay. Almost there. Okay. Get confused on these different. Okay. I'm gonna go with that and get started. Okay. I've still included this slide. I've made a move from GrowMIC, where I was for 17 years, to Glenwood about a year and a half ago. So just to keep introducing people to Glenwood as an organization, we're based in the Hudson Valley. It's a Glenwood Center for Regional Food and Farming. And within the organization, the 4 core programs there are: we have a farmer training program, local food for every table, building coalitions and educating our stakeholders. My role is within the regional food programs, and we're working to build food culture in tandem with our regional agriculture, and looking at building skill and expertise around crops that we can grow for food and various food and beverage applications. I wanted to start with this image here, just of this drawing of the rye plant, which is from the beautiful atlas, the root atlas, and just showing, demonstrating some of the depth of the root structure for rye, because we know that that's one of the main attributes that makes this grain really valuable in that winter segment for planting. I'm going to skip over this. I think Heather had a lot of this included in the background of where rye originated and how it came to the Americas. I'd found this slide, which was really interesting, around exports for rye currently. You can see that a lot of this is still very Eastern European, although Canada is up there with 10%. US is way down there at about 1%. So lots of room for growth. Of course, we're very interested in the domestic market, and in particular our regional market, but certainly events internationally have us paying attention to what's happening on the world stage. I found a record that showed 1633 was the first recorded planting of rye in Massachusetts. It raised some other questions about, was that never tried in Virginia? Was there something in particular about the northern climate, or the folks that emigrated over to the colonies to begin that production in Massachusetts? One of the early colonial foods was called rye and Indian bread, or thirds bread, which was made with wheat, rye, corn, and molasses. Really like this image a lot, showing how rye had expanded by 1908. And also that this is really pre-prohibition numbers here, and that prohibition was probably the leading thing that caused rye to fall off the radar and become less valuable for growers. And but just to see where rye was grown earlier in the previous century. And so you can see we had quite a bit there in the Northeast, New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and then the upper Midwest, Michigan, Wisconsin, into Illinois. We know that today a state like Oklahoma is producing a lot of rye cover crop seed, but it'd be interesting to see this map updated at some point, and hopefully how we can make it grow over the coming years. I think Heather covered most of this about why we value rye and its importance in our farming systems, and how it's so beneficial to Northeast farming systems in particular. I have to say that in terms of being a starter crop for our beginning grain farmers, I've watched a few of our farmers literally start from nothing, and it takes about 5 years, I think, for a beginning farmer to become competent in handling a crop, any kind of grain crop. And I've seen folks be able to enter the market with rye, whereas other small grains are really challenging. So growing wheat for sourdough bread production, for example, is very challenging to hit those specifications. Same for malting barley. So rye is kind of a great starter grain for our beginning growers who could have a ready market when that crop comes to harvest. As Heather mentioned, looking at the whole scope of opportunities here for where we could increase the rye markets, starting with cover crop seed. There's some, I'm sure Heather might know this number of, still a very dismally low number of farmers that are actually cover cropping. So improving a greater number of acres that are going into cover crops is definitely a priority. Getting more farmers producing seed for a grain crop. Looking at the food grade market, which is both flour for baking, and we've seen a real increase in use of whole grains and interest in whole grains and the prevalence of grain bowls. It's lots of kind of grab and go food markets now. We're seeing exponential growth in the distilling market, and I'll get into that more. And there's a small but very enthusiastic market for malts. So just starting with the food grade benefits, I'm also not a nutritionist and not a doctor by any means, but have grabbed some of these notes from multiple articles on some of the health benefits that have been documented. First and foremost, rye is very satiating as a food. It's high in nutrients and phytonutrients, lowers insulin resistance and helps regulate blood sugar, which is really amazing. It's linked to weight loss, reduces inflammation, risks of disease, including better digestive health and improving the gut microbiome. I'll just tell a story of this woman over here on the right. It's Trina Hanneman from Denmark. She has a bakery called Hanneman's Koken Kitchen, and in 2010 she did a rye smorgasbord here in New York City. And there were so many people that turned out for that event. It was pretty astonishing. And then I realized it was really Scandinavians who were showing up for their rye bread fix. And that was no joke. It was deep. It was very deep. Trina told us a story of when she was growing up that white bread was considered to be equivalent to having candy, basically. And that in order to have a white bread, they had to finish their rye bread first because that's where the nutrition was. The interesting thing is to see how these folks years later really, really crave those rye breads, and something that's very deep in the culture. Speaking of that, the image on the left is the Finnish Ruiz bread that Simo Kuutso had developed, also a Scandinavian who was working for the UN down here and could not find decent rye bread, and so started his own bakery. And it was very phenomenal to see how well that bread did at market. They sold out every day. So you've got this really intense, flavor, these funny shapes, and it just defied all of our expectations in terms of what would work in the market, and they just sold out all the time. And really interesting. And Simo probably helped launch our market for rye. I think with an introduction to Tor Oshner that prompted Tor to find some Danko seed and grow that out so that he could fulfill a contract for that bakery. So thank you, Simo, for getting us going there. In the middle image is bread alone rye bread, which Sharon Burns later developed after some trips to Denmark and really being inspired by the Nordic foods movement and bringing some rye breads to the Hudson Valley, some traditional rye breads, and also she does a really great einkorn bread. So this map was really interesting of showing different rye breads in Eastern Germany and just the breakout and the variability there. So I can read this detail. I don't know if folks can see it on the screen, but we've got the essential loaf, which is probably a blend of rye and wheat in countries like France and Spain. And then you have this dark, intense rye bread that folks make in Russia and the Baltics, but so much variation just in terms of style, and something that we're just starting to get to know in some ways in the United States. The distilling market and spirits is, yes, increasing exponentially. And this was an article just from last December from the Wine Enthusiast. I've seen several articles come through commenting on the explosion in rye. And my understanding there was that the rye whiskey actually was in this country was made first in Pennsylvania, and that was attributed to the Scots, Irish, and German settlers who settled in Pennsylvania and had a tradition of distilling with grains. And that was also impacted by shortages of rum, which was probably a predominant spirit in the colonies at that time. And that it's something that has crossed over the Atlantic at this point, where rye became an American spirit, but now is very much crossing over in the other direction, and a lot of interest from the Europeans in developing rye whiskeys. So what we're seeing in the market there is a focus on varieties, especially with the small producers. And we know that in order to compete in the marketplace and to get the price point that the small producers need, they have to be able to differentiate their products there. And so there's a very big interest in, is there, in the question of terroir, and how is that might be expressed. And I think that would be really interesting thing to explore in the coming years as we look at these different regions that are interested in exploring more rye. We know that I'm from Michigan myself, and there's a variety called Rosen Rye that some folks out there are trying to revive. It was a pre-prohibition variety that was the most commonly used for rye whiskey back in the previous early part of the century. Horton is an heirloom variety that New York Distilling is using. We know a lot of folks in the Northeast are using Hazlitt and Danko, and looking at how some of these other varieties perform. A couple of things on that, or one of the questions we have is, what are those between varieties? What are those different flavor profiles between hybrids and the open pollinated varieties? What are the differences there in those flavor profiles? Rye has something called a ferulic acid that turns into this compound called 4VG, which is a flavor compound that provides this clove, very spicy, vanilla, peppery component to rye whiskey. So very different than bourbon, which is considered a little sweeter, a little smoother. Rye whiskey is going to have that spicy note. So we're very interested in how those spicy notes and that complexity changes across varieties and potentially terroir. And there's growing interest from distilleries in exploring what that means. Yeah, they have a slide a little further on that shows some research there that is happening. So this was some images from the Empire Rye meeting, which is consortium of distilleries in New York that have focused on developing a New York rye whiskey in particular. Just looking at this opportunity across the country, this is an article that just came out last December, I think, from American Craft Spirits, and showing the number of distilleries that have really bloomed across the country in the last decade or so. So we're looking at New York State as number 2 on that list, just behind California. So New York's got about close to probably over 200 distilleries at this point. I'm sure a couple more people have gotten licenses. And then Pennsylvania, just behind New York. Texas was in there, if anyone was curious who was number 3. And then you can see the numbers of distilleries across the Northeast. So we did some calculations working with the distilleries that we had at our grain stand, and most of them were at a production phase of about an average about 6,000 cases a year. So that translated into about 100 acres of grain. So even at this point, if well, not all of those distilleries are making rye, first of all, but you can see that there's a whole lot of potential. So probably about 5 or 6 years ago, a few of the distillers in New York got together and wanted to create a standard of identity. Europeans have a system for this through the EU around designation or appellations, where food or beverage that is produced has regional and production specifications to it. And we don't have very many of those in the United States, so I was really excited to see this when they committed to doing an Empire Rye standard of identity. So you can see here the criteria. And it's really, if you ever have the opportunity to go to a tasting where you taste Empire Rye side by side, it's really fascinating. It's, even with this stated criteria, the distiller has a lot of creativity, within that 25% range if they add malted barley or an additional malted rye. How different, you could taste how different these expressions were even within that standard criteria. So we hope to see more of that, where folks can experience those differences there. Just want to reference a couple of other projects that are happening. Kentucky is doing a commercial rye and cover crop initiative, very much supported by the big distillery brands in Kentucky that are using a small amount of rye in comparison to what they're producing in terms of bourbon. But there have been, we see all of those major brands starting to do more development of rye products. And Michigan State has been doing some sensory research on some of those big brands. We hope to see some more research on some of our smaller and artisanal brands. And Far North Spirits did that. I think, this was published in 2021, but I believe they did the research on this a few years before. But it's very interesting to see the varieties that they worked with. And here's one of those, the results of those, where you can see some slight variation. So, in that yellow little triangle, that's that spicy 4VG component that I had mentioned. That's I would imagine we'll see some greater variability across rye varieties in that. But this is what some of that data looks like when you put it together. I think Heather addressed this in her presentation, but I had included just a little bit of information on the potential here for rye inclusion in feed rations. And I sent links and a couple of PDFs on these if folks are interested. Some of this research is coming out of KWS, and definite opportunities to do some more research there. And in addition to, this is from a previous presentation I reused. Obviously, Heather and her team are doing these rye variety trials, but we also have these included in the Organic Research and Extension Initiative, the value-added grains product that is led by Cornell, where we also have some rye trials happening at those Cornell research sites. So in terms of marketing and outreach, I've been working with a small group called Rye Revival and wanted to team up on some of the outreach and educational capacity there. And we've got a website with intention to build that out to become a resource room with current articles and research. And there's a Facebook page for Rye Revival and an Instagram if you want to follow along. One of the main participants in that group is Gary Zimmer, who some of you might know is a grower out in Wisconsin and has become a major proponent of using rye, and in particular using a system where his primary crop is corn, but he alternates it with a rye planting with lots of clover. And so he is basically generating his own inputs of nitrogen to support his corn crop. And here he's showing on the right, that photo is showing how scrappy, one of our other words to describe rye, can be just after a few days under frost and still throwing down roots in late November, early December. A few events that are coming up in over the next year, actually. Anyone here in New York City, there's a Rye and Castle 8 nights, February 22nd. That will be at Industry City at the Gun Hill Brewery, which has a new location there at Industry City. And then the annual field days. Cornell will have a field day in June of 2023. I went for the first time the University of Vermont field day last year, which was incredible. And lots to learn there on rye production, both in terms of the grain and its cover crop. October 16th, Glenwood will be hosting the Variety Showcase in Cold Spring, New York. And that will be through the Value Added Grains Grant. So we'll be hosting many of the small grains breeding programs and pairing them with chefs for a tasting event, which is a lot of fun. And we'll hope to add on some rye components to that. And that also falls over New York Rye Week, which will be October 14th to the 22nd this year. And hope to have lots of activities happening for that week. And that's it. Okay.
Great. That was fascinating and so much information about rye. And now I would love to open up the floor to any questions. You guys can send questions in the chat or feel free to unmute yourself and ask out loud. We do have one question in the chat from Sharon, and she asked, thank you, new to rye, learned much. Did you mention ergo?
Yeah, I did mention ergot briefly when I was talking about sort of some of the differences between hybrid rye and open pollinated rye, but I would say ergot is really the primary disease issue that we have in rye. And I'm going to put back up some slides so people can see the pictures of that. Go. And I think for most people who are not familiar with ergot, you are familiar with some pretty famous events in history, such as, Anthony's fire, such as like the Salem witch trials, things like that, that were really related to people eating rye bread or rye porridge that had ergot in it. And there's a picture of ergot down in the corner there, down to the right. And those are the fungal overwintering bodies of the ergot fungus. So it is a fungus. And these little bodies sort of grow out of the grain where the seed should be. And they're highly toxic to people and to livestock. And I haven't personally known of anybody in recent years getting sick from ergot, but it certainly still is an issue in cattle here in the United States, grazing grasses. So all grasses can get ergot and having issues with, you can see here it says gangrenous, which, gangrene, basically. And animals still have these issues today. But it has brought a lot of value to the medical industry, actually. And a lot of compounds have been derived from ergot, useful ones. But it is pretty, as I said, can be very toxic to people, especially even in larger quantities. Here's a better picture of that. Part of the reason rye is so susceptible is because it does flower over a long period of time. So its flowering structure is open. It also flowers, often during a wet period in the Northeast. And that's when these fungal bodies, those little sclerotia, actually germinate, and they make these little cups. There you go. There's a picture of it germinating. And once it germinates, those little fungal growths release spores, and that's what infects the grain again. So again, rye is very, very susceptible to ergot, and ergot can be very toxic to people. And most growers that are growing rye, I think that's the most major difficulty, is getting it out of the seed so they can sell it. It's hard to clean out, but yeah.
And then along those lines, Robert asked, is loose smut carried in saved seeds with rye crops?
Yeah, it can be. Yep. I feel like it's not, doesn't seem as prevalent, but it definitely, we've seen it in rye. I feel like ergot's more prevalent.
Yep.
Pick your poison, Robert.
And then Joy asked, how do we learn more about available cultivars or varieties? Are seed companies specifying this or not, due to emphasis on being a cover crop and only recently value added?
Well, there are a lot of, it's kind of exciting actually, because a lot of seed companies are now actually promoting varieties of rye because there is so much interest now with baking and distilling. So it's definitely become more prevalent in recent years. I feel like we weren't able to get different varieties of rye, 5, maybe 10 years ago, but now most major seed companies that sell grain seed are also selling different varieties of rye. So Seedway is an example. I think even in Johnny Seed, smaller sort of lots of seed, you can buy varieties. Albert Lee Seed House. I don't know, June, if there's others in New York, but yeah.
Yeah, no, those have been the main ones that I've heard of selling rye.
Yeah.
And then Joy also asked, where can we learn more about this and relevant post-harvest production? And by this, growing it rye in general.
Well, we June shared some of our research reports. I can put the link to our website in the chat. So we post all of our research on our website, so you can go there and find the latest research reports focused on rye. We have some growing guides there. There are a lot of great resources for learning how to grow grain, from small scale grain raising, which is a great book by Jean Lodgson, The Organic Grain Grower by Jack Glazer. So there are some reference materials. And then, NOFA New York, NOFA Vermont, UVM, Glenwood, getting on our mailing lists and, keeping up with outreach events. June named a bunch, but there's always events going on growing grain. I don't know if you have anything to add there.
No, just to encourage people to go to field days. I feel like that's where a good opportunity to talk to farmers, see what's happening on the ground, look at the equipment, what their flow through might look like depending on what they're doing on farm. But, at minimum, you want to be able to harvest and get your grain cleaned, at least with, an initial cleaning. It can go somewhere else for food grade, but from what I've seen, farmers really start to gain that information from talking to other farmers and going to field days and seeing different operations. So yeah, if Hudson Valley, Cornell Cooperative Extension, Ulster, and Washington, Aaron Gabriel and Christian Malazaki, usually do a few field days a year. We'll try to get Robert Perry back out there. Maybe he used to host a great. And there is, Hudson Valley Grain School next week on Tuesday, where we'll be talking about rye. Todd Hardy will be talking about rye. It looks like Robert asked about ergot issues with distillers. I have to find out what I know that fusarium does not come through in the distillate. And so that has been an important, in some ways, secondary market for our wheat growers. And I would say a very important secondary market. And some, maybe it's even become a primary market. But the fact that, that those mycotoxins won't go through the distillate is very important. Now, it will still be in the spent grain. So for folks who are using that spent grain to feed animals, it could be an issue there where you don't want to be giving a high toxin load to animals that can't take it. That's what I know. I don't know if you have more to add to that, Heather.
No. I do know, not for ergot, but for Dawn with malting. I know in other grains, it's been reported not to increase during the malting process, but the research has shown with rye, it actually does increase. So that is a concern that hopefully has gotten out there or addressed with maltsters. I'm not sure why, but it does.
Thanks, John. I'll just read that out for the benefit of small amounts are not an issue with the distillers that won't pass the distillation, except for a flavor issue if it's really loaded with it. That's from John Meyer.
I had a question so I work on a small no-till farm and we use rye as a cover crop, but on a really small parcel. And I was curious what the harvest technique is like for rye. Well, it certainly depends on your scale. I would say that if, there are small scale sort of options, but I think you have to really be dedicated to that. Most folks, are using combines, mechanical means to harvest. And there's lots of different types and sizes of combines that are out there. And possibly, someone close by the farm might have some way to harvest. You certainly can hand harvest, but it is, I would say, for a lot of people would be a labor of love. That the book by Gene Lodgson, Small Scale Raising, actually is a really excellent resource and takes you through multiple options based on scale of how to harvest grains. But I think for most people, if you're using, you said it's a small scale operation, if you're using a 50-pound bag of seed or a 100-pound bag, the amount of labor to hand harvest that much may not be worth the effort. It would be cheaper to buy a $17 bag of seed than, the investment to hand. Not that I want to not get people to do that, but I mean, that's what I assumed, but I was curious if there are any. We do have quite a group of homesteaders that raise small plots of grain to feed themselves.
and have come up with some pretty ingenious ways to sort of harvest and thresh, store, dry, all those things. And it's really great to hear about a lot of those. But Jean's book is a wonderful resource.
Great. Are there any more questions from the audience? Okay. Well, do you guys have any questions for each other?
We had, yeah, I think when we were, just before we got going, we were
Oh, yeah.
starting to talk about some of the differences between hybrids and open pollinated varieties. There's definitely a big push around hybrid varieties, but we're also seeing a lot of real interest in the OPs as well. And yeah, Heather, just wondering what you've seen so far.
Yeah, I think for most people that they don't know the difference, right? They haven't heard a lot about it. I would say feels like a relatively new topic area. For so many farms growing cover crops, they just, really want the cheapest, easiest available thing that they can get. But, now that people are harvesting more for feed in particular, they're looking for those higher producing varieties so they can get more per acre. But, variety named seed is more expensive. With the hybrids, I think there's the verdict is still out. We hear a lot about hybrids, they won't bake as well, they don't taste as good. Now, of course, if you look at the company data and you look on the website, you see things like great for distilling. I saw that with one of the varieties I was looking at the other day, great for baking and milling. And but if you asked other folks, they'd say, oh, it doesn't taste as good, which could, we know from experience that's likely true. So I don't think we've learned enough here about the hybrids and how they work to say much about it yet. And I see John saying he likes Danko. And that's interesting. He's saying if they're not planted shallow enough, they can be difficult. So I will say we put out a planting date by seed depth study this fall with a hybrid versus an OP. So it was Tayo versus Hazelet. Hazelet's a pretty popular variety, and Tayo's probably the highest producing hybrid that I've seen on the market. And we planted those at a 1/2 inch, 1 inch, and 1.5 inches depth at 6 different planting dates starting from mid-September through the end of October. So we'll see how they do. So far, based on the plant counts this fall, we haven't seen any difference, but we'll see.
I actually had a question for John, and I'm curious about other varieties that you've worked with. That's definitely, from what I've heard from most people, it's usually what they can get a hold of, and they may not even know the variety. And what we've seen come through is usually either Danko, Brasetto, starting to see a little bit of Hazelet. But I'm wondering if, John, if you've worked with any additional varieties in comparison to Danko. Okay, sorry.
It's a very suspenseful couple seconds.
Yeah, I feel like Hazelet seems to be the a very popular one here in Vermont, and we've collected some interesting data on that from bake tests, cookie tests, or shortbread tests, and just the data we've seen from our distilling lab work. That seems like a really popular variety, and it has some interesting flavor notes. So that's been a favorite here.
Looking forward to doing some of those bake testing and seeing a few of the differences, and like most of the volume that we've seen is in those three varieties, Danko, Hazelnut, and Brasetto. But yeah, I've heard bakers use one or the other, but not really comment so much. Not that we've asked them to before, but it's certainly going forward and trying to get more feedback from folks on those different attributes.
Yeah, the bake trials that we have done have really been focused on falling number and trying to understand if falling number is an important parameter for baking. And as I had mentioned, it is in wheat, it's critical. And the bakers that we have worked with that know what to look for with falling number have not wanted to buy rye that has had a low falling number. And those bakers that are, used to working with local growers, even if they see a lab test, they still bake with it because they want to make sure that, what looks good or bad on paper is true once they bake with it. And that was kind of, how we started thinking about this, because one of the bakers baked with a rye that had a falling number of, I don't know, 110 or something. And he said, oh, it worked great. And so that's why I was interested when I finally found a reference in the literature saying that the rye, falling number for rye, the recommendation is over 120 versus wheat again is, 250. So, yeah.
I mean, it's interesting even that was difficult to find.
I know.
Something.
You can Google or go to Google Scholar or any of the sort of journal search engines and type in rye and falling number, and nothing comes up. And I don't know how I found this article the other day, but it actually was listing, I'll have to send it to you, quality parameters for feed, baking, and biogas. So
Amazing.
yeah.
And when was that?
It was a pretty recent article.
Okay.
So I think it's in some way showing this renewed interest. It was out of Europe still, but I think it's showing this renewed interest in using rye as, as a grain, because of the fact that it's so adaptable and the inputs are so much lower than corn or, other grains that would be used in that place. So.
Nice.
Interesting.
Okay, well, on that note, I'm sharing the survey for everyone to share feedback on what they thought of the presentation and what we can do to make it more engaging. And I just wanted to thank both of you so much. I really had very little knowledge about rye in the past and also where it can go in the future. And this was fantastic. It was so informative and really a great amount of information. Thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you both so much.
Thank you.
Yeah, and enjoy the rest of the conference.
Will do.
Great. June, are you getting right off? Can I ask you a really